Good afternoon and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Today we delve into the complexities of the liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific has emerged as a critical geopolitical theater where the interests of major power converge, influence global trade, security, and diplomacy. As nations grapples with the rise of China, regional tensions, and shifting alliances, the Indo-Pacific stands at the heart of discussions on how liberal international order can be preserved amid these evolving challenges. Joining us is Dr. Bann Seng Tan, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Ashoka University. Dr. Tan is a renowned expert in international relations with a deep focus on security and political economy of the Indo-Pacific, a region that has become a focal point of global strategic and economic interest. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
It is my pleasure. It's good to see you again.
Sir, I would like to begin the discussion by asking that how do you define the liberal international order in the context of the Indo-Pacific region and what key principles underpin it?
Sure. Um, Generally speaking, I define the liberal international order as the post-World War II order that is led generally by the United States. You can have a liberal international order without US leadership, but generally is led by a group of countries that centers around the United States with its European allies, as well as a couple of states in Asia. So we are talking about countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, those from those countries whose interests, especially in the strategic level, align with the West. Some scholars and some diplomats, they prefer not to use the term liberal international order. They use the term rule-based order, right? To highlight the fact that it's not just a Western order, but it's more of a set of rules and norms that has underpinned the 50 years of economic prosperity and security since the end of the World War II. So it's that period where there was an agreement over the rules of the game, things like globalization, free trade, supporting human rights, respecting sovereignty, and so on. These are the rules of the game that seems to be challenged by a new set of actors that centers mostly around China, basically, right? Even though Russia is also an active autocratic power that tries to undermine the order. And this is the set of the rules of the game that, as the West and its influence have declined, seems to be repeatedly under challenge. So that's roughly what I mean by the liberal international order. Yes.
Sir, what do regional powers like India, Japan, and Australia play in maintaining the liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific, especially amid rising geopolitical tensions?
Sure. It's a legitimate question, but it is not the question I'm trying to answer in my book chapter. So let me just briefly talk about the book chapter, and I'm explaining where I'm coming from. So the book chapter is actually a contribution on the geopolitics of defending the liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific. And it's supposed to come out in the edited book, Palgrave Handbook of Geopolitics and Security in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's edited by a group of scholars that is based in the Central European University. So what I'm doing is just to contribute one chapter. In my chapter, what I'm giving is the perspective of the West. That is to say, if the Western countries want to defend the international order, how should they go about engaging with the countries in Indo-Pacific? So in a sense, I am not taking the regional powers like India, China, and so on as the main actor. I'm taking the West as the main actors, and I'm saying, look, if the Western order, if the Western influence and power are decreasing, less influential, and you still want to defend the liberal international order, how to go about it? What are the things you should consider? So I hope it's in an indirect way of answering your question by pointing out that my main actors, the agent here, is not the individual Indo-Pacific powers, but the West. And what can they do when they're engaging with the countries in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah. Sir, coming to China, with China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific, particularly through
Yeah,
initiatives like the Belt and Road, how can the
yeah.
liberal international order adapt to balance economic cooperations with concerns over sovereignty as well as security?
Yes. So the short answer is imperfectly, right? I acknowledge that the West generally has a weak hand of cards. That means they are playing from a position of a disadvantage. However, if you want to defend, if the West wants to defend the liberal international order, the promotion of liberal democracy has to be a core Western imperative. Another way of saying this, I cannot imagine a liberal international order without liberal democracy. That would be an oxymoron, right? Because it will be an international order, but it's not if there's no liberal democracy in Asia Pacific and Indo-China, then it's not a liberal international order. You have stripped out the core meaning. So I'm going to start with that assumption, right? So I'm going to point out that there are a set of perspective around two sets of questions. One set of question is over the issue of whether what is the state of the liberal international order? Is it declining or is it reviving? That means, is there a prospect for revival? So there's a group of literature that talks about this. Then there's a second group of literature that talks about the state of democracy in the world. Are we in what is known as a democratic recession? That means the number of democracies have decreased, and from now on, you're going to get less and less democracy. So there's a debate about this. One of the contribution in my book chapter is that I combine the two axes into one table. So you have two questions. Is the liberal international order reviving or not reviving? And then whether we are in a democratic recession or not. When you combine the two, you get a 2 times 2 table. And I'm saying that there are now 4 permutations of the way forward. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to quickly just show you one table that I'm planning to introduce in the book chapter. Keep in mind, this is a draft work, and we should probably put it right at the beginning that this is a draft work. It's a work in progress. I may still change some of the frameworks, but the basic idea is already there. It's just a matter of fine-tuning and the nuance of the argument. So give me a moment. Tell me if you can see the table. Give me a moment.
Yes, sir. It's perfectly visible.
Yeah, correct. So it's a 2 times 2 table between different scholars that argues about the near future of the liberal international order. Are we in a state where it's likely to collapse or where it's possible for it to revive? And the next one is this issue of whether the world is heading towards more and more autocracy, or there are groups of scholars who either disagree, that means they actually argue that the number of democracies have been fairly stable, or a lot of the literature are indifferent. Once you think about this, there are now there are 2 times 2 table, there are four possible permutation. And what I'm trying to argue is that the West should, depending on which cell they are in, which cell they think the state of the world is in, I'm going to prescribe a set of policies that deals with the interaction with the countries in Indo-China. Now, it's up to you. If there's an interest, I can briefly talk about the literature review about the two axes. Do you want me to do that, or you want to go
Yeah,
straight into the policy prescription? Yeah.
I would be
Oh,
happy to listen to that. Yeah.
sure. Okay. So, most of you will be familiar since the end of the Cold War with Francis Fukuyama, the end of history thesis. It's a very famous argument, right? This idea that the end of the Cold War represents the triumph of liberal democracy, and that's why it represents the end of history, because from now on, every country will eventually become democratic. So after the end of the Cold War, there was a certain moment of the triumphalism of the West. By around 2008, keep in mind 2008 was the Western financial crisis, right? The first economic meltdown in the West. And you have scholars like Kagan, who talks about a thesis of an autocratic revival, that instead of the autocracies retreating, some autocracies seems to be quite stable and doing quite well. Now, in 2008, when Kagan made the argument about the autocratic revival thesis, there were still scholars like Denune and Eikenberry who wrote articles criticizing the autocratic revival thesis. They basically point out that the West still has a lot of strong foundation and that it's just a momentary weaknesses of the West, and they highlighted the systemic weaknesses of the autocracy. This debate went on. By around 2015, the economic rise of China became so prominent. So there was a recent New York Times article which basically argued that from 2008 to about 2015, the Chinese economic growth was responsible for about 40% of the world total economic growth. That means the Chinese economic influence became more and more significant. So by around that time, there were another group of scholars in the Journal of Democracy, which tend to focus on the state of the world and about democracy. In the Journal of Democracy, they were addressing the issue again of what they call the authoritarian resurgence. Back then, they were trying to understand one of the issue was there is a rise of China. What are some of the long-term Chinese strategic objectives? So one scholar in Colombia, Andrew Nathan, who's a very notable Chinese expert, he argued that China foreign policy is essentially defensive. They see the world as being way too pro-democratic. So they want to change the world order from one that is biased in favor of democracy to one that is more regime-type agnostic. So in other words, according to Nathan, Chinese foreign policy is essentially inward-driven, directed to secure the competence to secure the political survival of the Chinese Communist Party. And couched in this way, it's a very defensive foreign policy, one that is not directly aimed at challenging the status quo in the international order. So there's a group of scholarship. Now, I just want to point out, over time, from 2015 onwards, the arguments in favor of a weaker international order became stronger and stronger. And it reached, in a sense, one of the high points or the inflection point around the 2002 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What was interesting was that the West, which was supposed to not react to the Russian invasion, actually united and imposed quite punitive sanctions on the Russian regime. That means the West actually had solidarity. NATO found a newfound purpose for its existence. So some scholars basically argue that the 2022 war actually represents an inflection point where there is a prospect for the revival of the international order. Now, as the war, as you know, went on for about 2 years now, so there are moments where the West, Ukraine seems to be winning, and there are moments where Russia seems to be winning, right? So that means there's been ebb and flow. But my point is that it's not a universal linear story of the decline of the West. There are scholars taking certain moments who argue that there may be a possible revival. So in my article, which is the one where I talk about the article is called The Revenge of the Democratic Peace, I basically argued that the 2022 war, and the article came out this was written in 2022, right? So the article basically argued that the Western powers are reacting more forcefully than what other people would have normally expected as the Western reaction. So that means it implies that the Western order may not be as weak as a lot of people have assumed. So there's a debate about this. Now I'm going to shift on to the other axis, which is on the democratic recession. Scholars like Larry Diamond, who is a very noted scholar on democracy, he argued that since around 2006, there was an inflection point in the global momentum for democracy. That means over time, democracy has now the number of democracies have started to decrease, the rate of democratization has started to falter, and a lot of the more previously democratic regime has backslid into autocracy. Now, this was the so-called democratic recession thesis. And there were scholars who challenged this, who argue that, who question the data, who argue that the number of democracies is still very strong, and there has been a mislabeling of certain autocracies as democracy, which is why when they backslide, they were reclassified as a case of a decline in democratization. Whereas if you treat them as autocracy in the first place, they are not actually backsliding, because they were never democratic in the first place. So there's a debate back and forth. By now, in 2022, generally quite a few scholars seems to agree that the number of democracies have been declining. So there's a sense in which the world has become more and more authoritarian. I just want to point out, in my paper, I talk about this issue of indifference. Many of the scholars who are talking about the liberal international order don't really care about whether democracies are actually active, or the state of the world in liberal democracy, especially in Indo-Pacific. That is to say, they are actually okay if the Indo-Pacific has a lot of authoritarian regime. And it turns out there is good reason why a liberal democracy might want to collaborate or negotiate with an authoritarian regime in the Indo-Pacific. So in order to explain all these things, I will talk about something called the selective theory, which is associated with the arguments of Bruce Bueno de Masluta. So can you see the book, The
Yeah.
Logic of Political Survival? So this
Yeah.
is a very prominent theory that explains why liberal democracies prefer to ally or work with autocracy. And I'm going to point out that even though the selective theory is pessimistic on democracy promotion, I'm going to use an argument from my other book here, which is on the foreign aid and democracy promotion, where I carve out a reason or a strategy to promote democracy using foreign aid nevertheless. So I combine the two together to come up with a strategy to defend liberal democracy in the West. Now, I'm going to I suppose I could pause to let you ask questions, or I can advance to the next table. It's up to you.
Yeah. It's up to you, sir.
Okay, fine. Then I'm now going to advance to the next table, right? So now I'm going to scroll down. Can you see table 3?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm arguing, let me, in a sense, backtrack to table 1. I'm saying that there are different scholars that emphasize different cells. The angle I'm coming from is actually from cell 4, where I think the war in Ukraine has now given the West a chance to unite, to show solidarity with existing liberal democracy. And I actually agree with the Larry Diamond argument that the world has become more and more authoritarian. And I argue that if you want a liberal international order, democracy promotion has to be part of a liberal foreign policy. In other words, you cannot have a liberal international order without liberal democracy. That means if you abandon that plank, it's no longer liberal, it's some other order, but it's not a liberal international order. So I take it as a foundation. Some scholars may disagree, but I think it's self-evident, right? A liberal international order needs liberal democracy. The question is how to get it. So now I move on to table 3. What I'm saying is that the West, when you are interacting with the countries in the Indo-Pacific, you are trying to answer several questions. The first thing is that you want to examine whether they are democratic or non-democratic. If they are non-democratic, there should be a strategy of regime change to try to promote them and push them towards democracy. So regime change has to be a foundational strategy of the West. But amongst the countries that are in the Indo-Pacific, some of these countries share a status quo with the West. And we can debate about which countries they are. Some of these countries, even whether they are democratic or non-democratic, they are revisionists. That means they are interested in overthrowing the liberal international order. And my point is, the West should think carefully which are the different countries in each cell. The strategy has to differentiate between the regime type of the country in question and whether the country is generally aligned with the West or not aligned with the West. So I'm going to start with the two easier one. The two easier one are in cell 1 and cell 2. Cell 1 is where the country is a liberal democracy and the country share the same alignment with the West. So these are countries which are the very few liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific. Basically, it's about 5 of them. So we are talking about Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand. And there are only 5. It's only 5 out of 26. So what should be the strategy? The West should exhibit unconditional cooperation with these countries. This can be things like free trade. This can be things like the sale of military weapons to have intelligence sharing. So you may be aware of the Five Eyes intelligence network. And I'm of the view that you can have intelligence sharing, but only between liberal democracy. Please don't share intelligence with autocracy. It's a really bad idea. They are going to use the information back against you. So it's only within liberal democracy. And you should be able to sell perhaps sensitive military technology. I guess a very prominent example is the horrible acronym, right? AUKUS, AUKUS, right? The alliance between Australia, UK, and United States to share sensitive nuclear submarine technology, the sale of nuclear submarines to Australia, right? Which the Chinese interpret as being directed against them, right? So my point is the sharing of sensitive hardware and technology is fine, provided it's done between the liberal democracy. And there is no problem here because these liberal democracies are pro-Western. They are strong supporters of the liberal international order. So to preserve the international order for this group, you need to defend them, right? You go all out to defend them. Now, what about cell 2? Cell 2 is here. Cell 2 refers to strong and major authoritarian powers which are non-democratic and they are revisionist. What they want is to destroy the liberal international order. So you can imagine that the top target will be China, basically, and then maybe countries like Russia and so on. So because they are permanently hostile or they are fundamentally hostile due to the nature of the regime type, there's no point trying to cooperate with them. Firstly, there isn't that many sharing of interest to have meaningful cooperation. And the West should basically adopt containment. And if containment means you try to reduce the influence of this authoritarian regime. But if the containment policy fail, then the West should prepare for confrontation. It doesn't mean the West wants a war. It just simply means you need to build up your military so that if you have a substantial military, you can now use deterrence as a possible strategic policy. Another way of saying this, you may have heard of the expression, if you want peace, prepare for war, right? Having a strong army gives you a huge bargaining advantage because the other side knows they cannot resort to force to get what they want. That gives the other side an incentive to negotiate with you in order to get what you want, which means that the stronger your army is, the easier it is to reach a negotiated outcome. So if you learn bargaining theory in more quantitative international relations, they will talk about this, right? Why is it that having a stronger military gives you a bargaining leverage? So these two are easy. And now I draw your attention to cell 3 and cell 4. These two are the difficult ones. For these two groups, so that's the third group, right? Where the first group, group number 3 is for countries that are non-democratic, but they are allied with the West for whatever reasons. The other group is countries which are democratic, but they are revisionist. For some reason, they are hostile to the West. My point here is that the general approach of the West should be where there is a deal. You reach a deal with these countries where cooperation is possible, but any deal should be on a strictly transactional basis. What do I mean? Think about when Donald Trump was the president of the United States. The various autocracy, we're talking about North Korea, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, and so on, they managed to find a way to influence Trump, right? Specifically, I'm going to be blunt here. they directly bribed Trump by giving businesses to his family members in exchange for a policy concession from the United States. So the autocrats learned how to interact with a more authoritarian leader like Trump. My argument is that the transactionalism can be applied by the West against the autocrats. So the West can play exactly the same game, right? You reach a deal with the autocratic leader, you make them an offer that is in the interest of the leader, so much so that the leader is willing to, in a sense, sell out their own country. Again, in bargaining theory, this is sometimes known as a side payment. You make a side payment to the leader as the agent. Effectively, you're asking the agent to sacrifice the interest of the principal. Like I said, this may sound somewhat how shall I put it, unorthodox. I should just point out that during the Cold War, the West have no problem reaching deals with authoritarian and autocratic leaders in the pursuit of the containment of the Soviet Union. So some of the Western allies, these are the military dictatorship of, let's say, Pakistan, some of the Latin America right-wing dictatorships. So they have a working relationship with the West, right? They now ally themselves by joining in the crusade against communism. And in exchange, the West closed one eye. They let the non-democratic nature of this regime go. So my point is, this has been done before, and the West need to revive this. Now, I still have. I'm looking at the time. So the other part of this is regime change. The West should adopt the arguments that are promoted in this book, where I articulate a strategy using foreign aid to advance democracy promotion, and that the West should be willing to seek regime change of those regimes that are not willing to collaborate with the West. Now, there are multiple ways you can go about it. You can treat them as an enemy, and then you go ahead and pursue regime change, whether those regimes like it or not. But what I'm suggesting is a milder version. In the milder version, the West reach a deal. You reach a transactional deal with the regime. And then you use regime change as a threat. What you're saying is this. I want a deal with you. I make some offer with you, right? We exchange some deal. I give you A, you give me B. If the autocratic regime doesn't deliver on its side of the promise, the West can now strategically pursue regime change as a way to put pressure on this regime. This idea that, okay, since you don't want to cooperate with me, then I would now seek to undermine your regime. Before you get into this issue of sovereignty and whether it's fair or not, we can cover this. I should just point out the Western liberal democracies have been complaining for quite some time that when they hold their election, countries like Iran, countries like Russia are infamous for interfering in the elections in the West. So my point here is this, two can play at the same game, right? If the autocrats refuse to respect the sovereignty of the liberal democracies, why on earth should liberal democracy not pay them back in the same kind, right? I mean, and here's the best part. If you promote regime change, that means you are promoting democratization of countries like Russia and so on. This is exactly what the Russian people want. This is what the opposition want. So I'm not imposing a regime that is hostile to the people. I'm giving the chance for the autocracy to go away and being replaced by the government of the people, exactly what the people in those regimes want. And I'm not saying this for the purpose of destabilization. That means I'm just saying this that this is just a way to put pressure on this regime so that they stop misbehaving. Because right now, a lot of the autocrats are basically doing whatever they want, and they are not facing that many consequences for their bad behavior. What I'm doing is to impose a cost on their attempts to overthrow the liberal international order. And that they have to understand that if they do that, some of their foreign adventures may result in an overthrow of the regime. And since the autocrats, according to the selectorate theory, all your autocrats want to survive. They want political survival. So you can be rest assured, every single autocrat wants to stay in power. So they will now seek to avoid this kind of situation. So my point is, it's not regime change universally. Regime change is pursued as part of a bargaining strategy in order to encourage policy compliance with some of these potential regimes in the Indo-Pacific in order to get them to agree to support the liberal international order. Right? So, and if you actually get regime change and you actually get a liberal democracy as a result of a regime change, I see it as a bonus, right? The world definitely need more, not less liberal democracy. In fact, I would argue one of the reasons why the world is so unstable now, with multiple wars breaking out in basically in the Ukraine and the wars in the Middle East that is breaking out, is part of the reason is because the world is becoming less and less democratic, right? And that there's a very famous theory. It's called the democratic peace theory. This idea that democracies don't fight wars against each other. The inverse is that as the world becomes less and less democratic, you do see an increase in war, which is exactly what's happening. So for those people who are interested in peace and international security, the democratic peace will suggest that promoting democracy is an important part of that strategy.
So, sir, moving to the next question, how does the United States Indo-Pacific strategy contribute to the reinforcement or transformation of the liberal international order in the region? How do you see this?
So right now, the US is in a very polarized state, and that there is a major election, which means that right now, at least for the next few months, the US is in a holding pattern. That means you're unlikely to see a major foreign policy initiative or a change. Any change is probably after the election, whoever wins, right? So unfortunately, I think it's probably true that if Donald Trump wins, he doesn't seem to be, at least from the way I read his foreign policy orientation, he belongs to what is described as the isolationist camp, where basically United States as a major power abandoned its responsibility and basically let the liberal international order collapse on its own. Right. So basically the United States want to focus on its own domestic strategy, its domestic affairs, and basically stop its hegemonic duties. If that happens, I think the liberal international order is going to be in a lot of trouble, and that the research will have to answer a really important question: is it possible to have a liberal international order without a liberal hegemon? That means without a center, without some major power leading the initiative. And if US refuse to lead, the next question becomes whether the coalition of European Union states can step up or not, right? So that is another problem. And then there are even more painful questions, right? Because there are only a couple of liberal democracies in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. If the US abandon them, and if the West refuse to support them, it will not surprise me, and I don't have a proof of this, but it will not surprise me if the policy makers in, let's say, Australia and Japan are asked, and as well as South Korea, right? I know South Korea is definitely discussing this. Are these powers, are they in their desperate attempt to defend themselves, are they going to become full-fledged nuclear powers? That means they acquire their own nuclear weapons. I know for a fact South Korea and their policymakers have already started talking about this, right? But because they are so worried about the US abandoning the South Korea-US alliance, and because they face a threat from North Korea, there are serious discussion about whether South Korea should now acquire their own nuclear weapons as a strategic deterrent. I'm guessing, although I don't have a proof, I'm pretty sure same conversations is happening in Japan and probably Australia as well. So I think there's a more difficult world, right? A world full of nuclear weapons sounds to me very dangerous, right? So yeah, I would prefer if we don't go down that path, right?
Yeah. So I had a chance to interview a few experts from these regions, and that was definitely in discussion, this topic. Yeah. So moving to the next question, what impact does quadrilateral security dialogue have on strengthening a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific, and how does it
Yeah,
fit within the larger framework of the liberal international order? How do you see
sure,
Quad in general in considering the challenges in the area of Indo-Pacific?
sure. So I'm going to make one point about the literature, and I'm going to argue against that general view in the literature. the popular and the diplomatic literature coming out from the West is that as the West weaken, it should seek partners, friends in the region who are sympathetic to the West and, in a sense, either ally with them or let the allies, the regional allies, do the heavy lifting. So there's this emphasis on multilateral cooperation, the Quad and all these regions and so on, to have all these regimes that can be brought in to become a proxy supporter for the international order. Countries like India figure quite prominently. Countries like Vietnam figure quite prominently. The more right-wing leaning think tanks in the United States, they like to champion India as an example of a country that is rising, that the West needs to bring on board in order to promote and defend the liberal international order. So that's the view, right? So there's a book title called Geopolitics and Democracy. I think the book is written by Trubot. My pronunciation is poor, right? So yeah, I beg from forgiveness from the authors, Trubot and Vergon, right? So it has a book came out recently called Geopolitics and Democracy. They talk about how the liberal international order has weakened over time. And they argue that now that the liberal order has weakened over time, and the argument is that it's not because of the authoritarian threat, it's because there was a fragmentation in the relationship between the elites of the West and the people of the West. That now the people of the West is a lot more reluctant to support what is known as liberal internationalism. That means an aggressive liberal foreign policy that champion the liberal international order. United States act as the world policeman. United States have military bases in many places in the world. United States intervene to put out fires throughout the world. So the people of the West have rejected this. So now it seems like there are multiple different options. So through the book talks about three scenarios, and I'm going to talk about one of the scenario where the West has basically retreat. So in the retreat scenario, it means that the major powers, especially the United States, basically give up the rest of the world and just concentrate on the hemispheric defense, that just the defense of North America, and basically, in a sense, give up the rest of the world to all the authoritarian regime. Insofar as they participate, they withdraw their troops from the regions that are tangential to the strategic interests of the West. So perhaps regions in the Middle East and in Europe. And basically, this will imply, for example, the war in Ukraine is actually a non-strategic theater from the West, and then shift their forces that are to the more strategic theater, which is defined as Indo-Pacific. That means the West reorientates to focus on the East. And that instead of the United States basing their troops everywhere, like let's say the US troops in Okinawa, for example, what they want is something called friendshoring or offshore balancing, where the bulk of the military force is provided by the Asian allies, and United States, if it intervenes, it acts as an offshore balancer. That means, for example, if there's a conflict, the Japanese troop will go in first, and then the United States will come in second wave as part of the reinforcement. But the US is not part of the first wave that will come into any conflict. So the US basically function as I guess you call a fleet in being an offshore balancer to balance out whatever authoritarian threats there is. This seems to be the view that is quite popular and prominent in the more right-wing think tanks and the more Republican think tanks here. They either want a complete isolationist foreign policy, that means the US withdraw from everything, or if they intervene, the US intervene only as an offshore balancer, where the bulk of the heavy lifting is done by the existing powers, and the US only come in as a last resort. That seems to be more acceptable to the more, I guess you can call it the MAGA, right? The Make America Great Again crowd. This is something they seem to be somewhat willing to tolerate. They as far as I can tell, they don't want a foreign policy where the United States troops are everywhere, and they think that this is something that they are not interested in anymore, right? So there's a reorientation of one wing of the U.S. foreign policy. That's the first part, right? So I say this is the viewpoint. My chapter argue against this viewpoint, and I argue against it not because it's whether it's possible or not. I mean, there's an issue of the efficacy. I argue against it because by doing so, the West is now allying itself with certain important countries. Granted, they are important, but these countries are not liberal democracy. They are either authoritarian or they are flat out military dictatorship and so on. The problem with doing that is that you are now creating an Indo-Pacific that is dominated by non-liberal democracy who happen to be allies of the West. By doing that, you are now creating a world where there's more, not more autocracy, less liberal democracy. What I'm saying is a world in the Indo-Pacific where there is more liberal democracy, less autocracy, is more sustainable for the liberal international order. The current strategy seems to be not to promote liberal democracy, but ally with the autocracy. You're actually helping the autocracy. And I'm saying that you may gain some short-run security advantages, but in the long run, you're making it harder and harder to defend the liberal international order. Because to me, it's self-evident. A world where there is less liberal democracy is going to find it much harder to sustain the liberal international order. Because my foundational assumption, right? If you want a liberal international order, you need liberal democracy. I don't see how you can have a liberal international order without liberal democracy. If it's only confined to the West, I think it's a more dangerous one, right? So that means you have to promote it. You know what that means? It means that certain countries like India, Singapore, Vietnam, and I can show you some of the tables. Some of these, I can show a table where I discuss the countries. Some of these countries might not belong to the full cooperation list. Another way of saying this, and here I'm going to share the table with you again, right? Okay. Can you see the table?
Yeah.
Okay. My point is, some of these countries are here. The right-wing Republicans seems to want to shift these countries that are in cell 3, they want to shift it to cell 1. And because they are willing to collaborate and cooperate with these countries, they are willing to close one eye on the non-democratic nature of some of these countries. And that's why in the book chapter, I describe this type of foreign policy as effectively the West kowtowing. That means kowtow is a Chinese word. It means you bend down and you show your deference and so on. It's a very pejorative term, right? The West is basically kowtowing to the Asian autocracies. I think that's wrong, right? I think that the West should be slightly more aggressive and seek regime change, right? And effectively push back against some of this regime. Now, since you haven't brought this up, but I'm going to talk about this. So I've been talking about liberal democracies and autocracies, right? I haven't named any of them, right? And the naming of this regime is going to be very sensitive, but it's not. Remember, I'm coming from political science in IR. Remember, there are literatures, data sets like Polity, Freedom House, Variety of Democracy, and a particular think tank known as the Economic Intelligence Unit. So there are data sets that collect on the regime type. So now I'm going to scroll up. Tell me if you can see table 1. Can you see table 1?
Yeah.
Okay. So I went back on the regime type and I look at 2023 because this article is written in 2024 and usually the different data sets have a 1-year lag. I do not use Polity 4 because as far as I'm aware, Polity 4 seems to have stopped updating their data set. So I don't have the latest figure from Polity 4. There are issues with the variety of VDEM data set. It's a very complicated data set. So I'm going to put it to one side. So I use the Economic Intelligence Unit and their fourfold typology, how they classify the different regime type. Now you will notice, out of the 27 states in Indo-Pacific. So Indo-Pacific simply means South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia, as well as the Australia and the basically the Pacific Island region, right? That means Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. It excludes Central Asia. So Afghanistan is taken out of the list. Now, so you will notice here, there are only 5 liberal democracy. This is the list, right? And then according to EIU, these are the different types of regime. Most of them are flawed democracy, and some of them are, quite a few of them are authoritarian regime. So my first point is this, the Indo-Pacific, going by the conventional view, out of 27 states, only 5 countries are liberal democracy. Another way of saying this, the majority of the countries in the Indo-Pacific are not liberal democracy. And it gets worse. I use Larry Diamond. So this is not me. I'm using Larry Diamond, and he wrote an article in the Journal of Democracy very recently, where he criticized the regime type of 4 regimes. And he argued these are not really democracy. If they were democracies, they are no longer democracy. So I disagree with the EIU classification that these 4 countries are flawed democracy. As far as I'm concerned, they are either hybrid regime or they are basically authoritarian regime. So that we are clear. That means you have to think about how to interact with them. They do not deserve the full cooperation that is in this group. Now this is I hope I have convinced you that I have referred to several data sets, and it's not just my opinion, how I classify the regime. I cite the literature, Larry Diamond. That means I cite prominent, serious scholars who question the democratic nature of some of these regimes. So it's not my opinion. This is from the literature. I need this point to be clear. It's not a personal opinion. So now that you know these countries, Table 4, I want to emphasize Table 4, and I hope this is recorded, right? Table 4 is speculative. It's not finalized. But right now, this is my first draft of what I think the 4 groups of countries need to be slotted into the 4 foreign policies for liberal democracy. So now I'm going to scroll down to Table 4. Right, give me a moment. Here, can you see Table 4?
Yeah.
So the 5 countries that are easy, right? They belong to liberal democracy. The West should have unconditional cooperation. That means there's no limit. You help them as much as possible. This is going to sound sensitive. Somewhat problematic. This is similar to, let's say, the Western support for Israel, right? It's almost unconditional, right? You give as much support as possible. For the countries that are permanently hostile, here we are talking about Asia, so it's basically China and the Chinese client states. So these are the countries that belong to here. You will notice this number 1 and number 2 are very clear, right? The bulk of the countries are in number 3 and number 4 because a lot of the Asian countries are not, they are not really fully fledged democracy. So I'm going to put 3 countries that are very clearly they are non-democratic, but they seem to have a pro-Western alliance policy. So these 3 are Singapore, Vietnam, and Mongolia. Singapore is because it's a small state, and he has historically a pro-Western foreign policy. And then Vietnam is because it's faced military threat from the China has military claims over some of the islands in Vietnam. Right? Mongolia is because it's a very unusual country. It's a somewhat democratic country that's stuck between China and Russia. So now you have a lot of countries that are right in the middle and the countries that are here, right? So those countries that are in yellow are the countries where I'm still thinking where they belong to. That means there's some room for debate where they belong to. Either there's not enough information about the country, or I'm making very broad brush stroke. Because I'm only writing a book chapter, I do not want to spend, in other words, I don't want to spend a lot of time on each individual country, because then it will not be a book chapter, it will be a full book, right? Because I don't have the space in the book chapter to cover that. So I'm just suggesting to the West that they should really reevaluate the democracy conditions of some of these countries. And they should really think carefully whether they want to have unconditional cooperation. Because some of these countries are, how should I put this, only tactically cooperating with the West. The moment it is up, the moment it is in the interest of these countries to betray the West, I think they will do it without a second thought. So I'm very wary about too much support given to these countries on the assumption that they will remain committed to the liberal international order. So I understand that from the Prode, you talk with a lot of Indian foreign policy makers, right? So I used to be based in Turkey. Countries like India and Turkey, what we sometimes call middle power, right? In II is known as a middle power. A lot of the middle powers, they see themselves as a regional hegemon. As the liberal international order collapse or weaken, these kind of middle powers have a tendency to see it not as a problem. They see it as an opportunity. They see it as a chance for them to step into the power vacuum as the West retreat. And they think that now is our turn, our chance to lead, our chance to dominate. Do you follow? That means they may not be, how should I put this? I think in their actual preferences, they may be actually okay if the liberal international order collapse. Put it another way, if the LIO, the liberal international order collapse, I think Japan will be very unhappy. Australia will be very unhappy. But some of these middle powers, I think in their hearts of heart, they are perfectly fine, right? They see it as an opportunity for them to lead. And some of them are quite blatant about this, right? That's why they talk about the language of the global south. It's time for the global south to tell the north how to behave, and we will no longer take orders from the west and so on. My point is, the west should be very careful about its allies. That's all I'm saying. When I put it in yellow, what I'm trying to say is that I am not saying these countries definitely belong to this country, belong to this category. I'm saying that the West need to take a hard look at the nature of these countries and what their actual interests are, and whether some of these interests is specific to that particular government. That if the government should collapse, maybe a new, more democratic government can have a radically different foreign policy. I'm just going to point out that in the case of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, right, it's because these two countries recently underwent a regime change. So the status of these countries is a bit uncertain right now because there is what we call in political science, there is an interregnum, a period where there is a transition between one government to a new regime. So it might be one government to a new government within the same regime, but it might be one government to a new government in a different regime, right? And it's not clear whether it's heading towards a more democratic direction or towards a more authoritarian direction. So these three countries, I'm a bit reluctant to put them in, as in it's not clear which direction they are leaning to. The majority of the countries belong to cell three, right? Where it's not clear where they stand. And insofar as they are pro-United States, it's only because China has been making a lot of territorial claims on, let's say, the South China Sea Islands and so on, which affects a lot of the Southeast Asian countries. So that gives an incentive from, I don't know, Malaysia, especially Philippines, right, to do something about it because they feel threatened by China. So because they feel threatened by China, they are more inclined to work with the United States. But I don't think, for example, Philippines is a democracy. I mean, yes, you hold election, but the holding of elections is not the defining characteristic of a democracy. It's whether the people, the government actually respect liberal democratic values. And most of this government, as far as I can tell, they don't. They clearly do not respect liberal democratic values. So how should I put this? I'm arguing against the conventional view in the literature. That's why I would like this to be one of the contribution of the book chapter. Right? So, but the book haven't been, I mean, the chapter had to be submitted and then you had to undergo the review process. Hopefully my reviewers agree with me, but I don't know. It's up to the reviewers. Right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so sir, I want to raise one more question. Like you talked
Yeah.
about India, and like I do a lot of podcasts and interview with Indian policymakers, and a different sort of viewpoints also I receive from them. So I want you to emphasize a bit more on India's side, India's role in the global international order, as well as how do you see India's role in context to India's relationship with China, with the US, and India's stance on the Ukraine war. On the ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine, primarily Russia's illegal war in Ukraine.
So I can try to respond to you, but I'm going to make the important caveat that the book chapter is not about India, right? It's mostly from the Western perspective on what to do with the countries in Indo-Pacific, of which India is just one of them. Insofar as India sees China to be a, I don't know, I guess a competitor for regional influence, Indians' strategic interests right now align with the West because the West want to contain or at least curb or reduce Chinese influence. So for now, there's an agreement in terms of strategic interest. However, according to people like Larry Diamond, one more time, Larry Diamond makes this argument, not me, right? India is not really a democracy, which means that in the long run, so long as the liberal international order needs to have more, not less liberal democracy, there is a tension here that there might be a long run divergence in the interest between India and the West. Because right now, India is not a liberal democracy. The West seems to have taken the attitude that this is not a problem. I will just close one eye. I will just let the authoritarian government do whatever they want in exchange for strategic compliance. My point is this is something of a Faustian bargain. You may really regret you may get some short run advantage, but you may pay a price for it in the long run. Because again, in the book chapter, I make a foundational assumption. If you want the liberal international order, you have to promote liberal democracy. You can let a couple of countries go, but if you consistently undermine liberal democracy in the Indo-Pacific, you're going to end up with an Indo-Pacific that is full of autocracy. And when that happens, you really should not be surprised when none of the autocracies have an interest in supporting the liberal international order. None of them is going to do it, right? Because it's against their interest. So I'm arguing it is in the long-term interest of the West to seriously start thinking about promoting of liberal democracy. And this book of mine, right, this book of mine has a strategy on how to do it, and he do it in a way that doesn't I mean, it will still irritate the autocracies, but it's not designed to maximize confrontation. In fact, I think it suggests a strategy that do it in a way that minimize conflict with the major autocracies. So I'm saying there's a way to do it. There's a cheap way to do it. If you care about the long-term future of the liberal international order, you have to think about this. If you don't do it, you really should not be surprised when the Indo-Pacific become completely autocratic, then it will be hostile to the liberal international order.
Uh,
Oh,
Now I
you,
want to
yeah,
ask you about the primary challenges. So, what are the primary challenges to maintaining a liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific? And, how can regional cooperation and diplomacy address these issues effectively?
sure. According to the Troubaud and Burgon book, the main challenge comes from the lack of will in the West. That is to say, I think there are scholars who basically argue for a more forceful, a more liberal foreign policy. The problem is not that there is an absence of a strategy. I think there are viable strategy. There is an absence of political will to execute the strategy. Part of it is because some of the elites don't see it. I mean, elites as in the current leadership of liberal democracy. Let me give you an example, right? I'm not trying to be rude here, but many scholars have criticized the foreign policy of the Chancellor Scholz, which is in Germany, right, for being way too sympathetic towards Russia. Not even in the early years of his power and is still sympathetic towards Russia even now, 2 to 3 years into the Ukraine war. In other words, the West is not committed to a proper strategy of confrontation and containment with the authoritarian governments. And in the book chapter at the beginning, I pointed this out, right? The autocrats may be less united, but there's a sense in which the autocrats feel that the West is highly disorganized and the West seems to lack an internal coherence. That means they haven't figured out what they want. Whereas countries like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, they seem to be very clear on what they want. They want to overthrow the liberal international order. They want to, in a sense, rewrite the rules of the game. Another way of saying this, right? After the end of the Cold War, the world was gradually safer for democracy. The current generation of autocrats, in the pursuit of political survival, is trying to make the world safer for autocracy. And that the West, I would like the West, when they think about it, to really start thinking about if you're facing such a systematic threat coming from autocracy, you need to have a more coherent strategy for thinking about it. And my book chapter presents several frameworks how to think about it. And I phrase it as a question. I'm not saying that my view is the correct one. I'm saying there are 4 possible views. You pick your one that you pick the cell that you think. Let me just go up. That means you pick, there are table 3, there are 4 cells. You pick the cell that you think the world is in now, and you carve out a strategy designed to adapt to that particular cell. I am picking this. I'm sorry. You pick this cell. There are 4 cells. You pick different cell. I'm assuming we are in this cell, and I'm trying to carve out a strategy that address this possible cell. If you happen to think that the liberal international order is not collapsing and democracy is not under threat, then fine. You can have a different strategy adapted to cell 3. So we are, because different scholars have different views on what is the current state of the world, right? So I'm just taking a particular view, trying to address the issue of both democratic decline and trying to defend the liberal international order.
Yeah. So I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that what is the way forward from here? How do you see the world going, especially considering the war in the Middle East as well as in Eastern Europe? What's the way forward according to you?
There is a lot of uncertainty because many countries, including Russia and some of the, I think including Israel and some of the Middle Eastern countries, including Iran, they are just basically waiting for the US election. They are waiting to see who wins. If it is Donald Trump, it's going to be a very different world, right? And that some of the autocrats, it seems to me, are betting that it will be Donald Trump, right? If it is Kamala Harris, then there is a chance there will be still more of the same, because from what little we know now, Kamala Harris foreign policy seems to be more or less aligned with the Biden foreign policy, right? So that means not that much change. So we have to wait to see what happens with the US election. But wait, you are asking me the going forward, right? There's another
Yeah.
issue which this is not in the book chapter, but it may be in the conclusion of the book chapter. I haven't decided yet. There is a reason why the countries, the smaller countries, here, let me just go back to the table. There's a reason why the countries in this group might have a strong interest to ally with the West. It's because a lot of these countries have a very particular industrial profile. Let me just take one step back, right? So you know that Chinese economic growth has been supposed to be one of the major developmental story for 50 years of rapid development. Most scholars agree that period of rapid Chinese growth has basically ended, right? That means the Chinese economy is now slowing down. The international organizations like IMF and the World Bank, they advise China, in order to maintain its economic growth, the correct strategy is to boost the spending power and increase the salary of the average Chinese worker so that the Chinese consumer consume more, so that you stimulate the economy from inside China, right? That's the orthodox Western prescription. As far as what the observers can see, China doesn't want to do that. That is to say, Xi Jinping, for whatever reason, he just refused to do that. His strategy is to double down on the industrialization and the export-driven strategy. That means the state rebuild up, recapitalize all the industry and export, produce more consumer goods and sell it to the West, sell it to the rest of the world, right? So this is a very prominently in things like renewable energy, green energy products, like for example, solar panels, car batteries, and especially electronic vehicles, right? So China is accused of dumping the electronic vehicles in regions like Europe and in the West. That's one of the reasons why the Western countries have been putting tariffs and sanctions, or not sanctions, trade restriction on Chinese export, because they are worried that the Chinese export will basically flood the market and cause a collapse of their domestic manufacturers. So that part is clear, right? So here's the point that it becomes relevant to the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese export-driven model is a threat to the countries that are in cell three, because a lot of these countries are industrialized or industrializing countries. Their growth model requires them to export to the West, because the Chinese market is the biggest one, right? So if the Chinese market pursue the Chinese government pursue exactly the same strategy as Vietnam, and because China is a bigger market, right, they now outcompete the Vietnamese, which also means that now the Vietnamese understand that the Chinese growth model that is being pursued by the Chinese Communist Party is actually a threat to the long-term economic growth of Vietnam. You follow? That means now the different countries have an economic reason to be more careful about trade and collaboration with China. Because if they help China grow further, and the Chinese strategy is to outcompete everybody by effectively flooding the world with cheap consumer goods while suppressing Chinese labor wages, right? That's the growth model. That is very similar to the strategy pursued by most of these Southeast Asian countries, which means that because the Southeast Asian countries are weaker, they are smaller relative to China, it's going to hurt the economic growth. And that is something that the West can use as a bargaining leverage to get these countries to, how should I put this, form some kind of trading arrangement with the West, as opposed to unrestricted free trade with China. So, and I have just articulated a reason why some of these countries might have not just a strategic reason, right? Strategic reason would be things like Chinese territorial claims on their whatever South China Island disputed islands. I'm talking about here an economic threat by China by virtue of the economic development strategy that is currently pursued by the Chinese authority. And that is something that a lot of countries have noticed, because they realize how impactful the Chinese market is. Right? So
Yeah.
that's something that's food for thought, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. I really hope the world becomes less of a dangerous place to live in, and more and more countries inclined towards the idea of democracy. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you.